Chapter 22. Jennifer. August 1928. Timothy had returned to St. Thomas from Puerto Rico aboard the Hannah Gums with a cargo of freight, 6 grunting breeder hogs, and 5 passengers, and he was unloading at the King's Wharf when Josiah Red walked up to him and said, "De cap'n done bust the rope." Her husband had died. The frail, gray-haired woman in a wide white hat stood on the wharf midships of the Hannah Gums, her face sad and grave. "I'm sorry to hear that. Josiah was a good man," Timothy said, his own face suddenly sad and grave. They'd been friends for years, had helped each other obtain cargo and passengers. "He bombed in Antigua. The Hetty Red still down there," she said. Her husband was embalmed in Antigua, and his schooner was still there. "I'd appreciate very much you fetch him home." Timothy did not hesitate in saying yes. Antigua, a British possession, was some 300 miles southeast in the Leeward Islands near Barbuda and St. Kitts. Timothy had sailed the Hannah Gums down there many times. Now he would have to lay her up for a few weeks and lose some income. But his long friendship with Captain Josiah required him to help Mrs. Red. She smiled briefly, nodded, and moved off into the dockside traffic of horse carts and stevedore hand carts. He watched her go, wondering why he'd never taken a wife of his own. His hair was now as gray as hers. He thought he was in his late 50s, too late for marriage and children. He often wondered who would mourn for him when the flame in his own lamp flickered out. The following Tuesday he boarded the Furnace Whitney line ship Cardis for the day-and-a-half voyage to Antigua. He hadn't sailed on a steamship since the Bartolina. There were no docks at St. John's, Antigua, and schooners had to anchor in the sheltered waters, as did steamships. Barges with great sweep oars took the cargoes between the anchorages and the warehouses. Timothy spotted the Hetty Red not long after the Cardiff passed through the narrow neck and entered the harbor. She was sturdy, a good vessel in a stormy seaway, Josiah had said. As soon as immigration and customs cleared the Cardiff, Timothy went ashore and headed directly to the funeral home. Though the man in the wooden box was an old friend, Timothy had to steel himself against certain misgivings about the voyage. It was bad luck to transport the dead on a wind-powered ship. He'd always heard the spirits of the ocean breeze would become angry if they discovered what was in the box. The papers were signed. Keeping his eyes away from the casket on the donkey cart, he walked beside it to the lightering wharf. The donkey threaded through a herd of goats in the jasmine-scented air. Smoke rose from hills beyond the harbor as wood was burned to make charcoal. After the box was offloaded, he made arrangements to take Josiah out to his beloved Hetty Red, telling the boy who owned the rowboat to wait a while. Then he walked to the corner of Market and St. Mary's to the office of Mohan Singh, shipping agents, to see if they had any cargo or passengers to be forwarded to St. Thomas. "The cargo is aboard, and you'll have 4 passengers," said one of the Singh sons, a handsome East Indian. "When will you sail?" "Sooner the better," Timothy replied. The hurricane season had begun in July, though none had swept up the Antilles as yet, but the stillness of the early September air made him uneasy. Flags hung limp. Palm fronds were silent. "Tomorrow morning?" Shri Singh asked. Timothy nodded. "I'll see to it that your passengers are on board by 8 o'clock. Timothy nodded again. "Anything about the weather?" Ships sometimes sent messages by cable or radio to report tropical disturbances. Shri shook his head and smiled. "But it is hot, isn't it?" Timothy agreed. "Very hot." As he left Mohan Singh, he had an ominous feeling. The face of the sea had changed during the night, he thought. The long rollers were smooth as glass. He signed for the cargo that had already been put in the red and returned to the lighter wharves to be rowed out to the schooner with Josiah in his box. The harbor was active this day, and Timothy looked from ship to ship, trying to ignore the casket. Soon the boat bumped up against the white hull, Timothy shouting to deckhands Alfonso Jarvis and Wilmer Lockett to come and help take Josiah aboard. Alfonso said, "You be captain and take us home." Timothy frowned up to the young black sailor. "Why you think I'm here?" He knew these boys from Charlotte Amalie. They were all right. Captain Red wouldn't have allowed fools to work his deck. The passengers came aboard just before 8 in the morning, Alfonso and Wilmer taking their luggage to the cabin space below. There were 6 bunks down there, but the ventilation was the same as sleeping in a closet. Except in heavy rain, straw mats on deck offered cool breezes and a view of the stars. The Negro passengers were John Dewes and Dr. O. W. Bird, going to visit relatives in the British Virgins. The white passengers were Merchant Oliver Rankin and his 10-year-old daughter, Jennifer. All were British subjects. Rankin said, "We could have gone on a steamer, but I wanted my daughter to have a voyage under sail." Jennifer was a fair-skinned, green-eyed redhead, Timothy said to her. "Best you stay in the shade," Dr. Bird advised the girl. "Put some vegetable oil on your face and arms." "I have a parasol," Jennifer said. "The sun'll roast right through this silk," Timothy said. "Listen to them," her father said. The Hetty Red swung around while Alfonso and Wilmer walked the capstan to heave in the anchor. Timothy stood at the helm, eyeing the sails, then moved in a few spokes as Alfonso shouted, "Anchor home!" and the schooner got under way. There was barely enough wind for steerage. As she passed slowly through the draw, Timothy, unable to shake off the ominous feeling, searched the heavens for cirrus clouds. They were usually the first signs of a hurricane. If a tempest was on its way, they would stretch in bands and gradually thicken to cirrostratus, rising to great heights. Timothy knew the cirrus as cattails, slender, wavy, parallel lines penciled in white on the blue sky. When the fine threads of the cirrus appeared to be blown or brushed backward at one end toward the roof of the sky, the wind would sooner or later veer around to that point. He'd seen it happen. The course was west by north, skirting the islands of Nevis, St. Kitts, St. Eustatus, and Saba, finally angling by Virgin Gordo and on into St. Thomas. By mid-afternoon the breeze was as dead as Captain Josiah. The schooner drifted helplessly about 15 miles off Antigua, her sails not even flapping. The long swells were as thick as the silk on Jennifer's parasol. The heat bore down on the Hetty Red. Timothy sat on a fruit box by the helm and studied the barometer, which measured air pressure. It was abnormally high. He was uneasy. At sundown, there was a threatening, flashing red border across the west horizon, and through the thin veils of cirrus clouds, a solar halo could be seen. Timothy studied it while the Hetty Red drifted. Alfonso, the oldest deckhand, asked, "We gonna get the tempest?" He asked it quietly so the passengers couldn't hear. Timothy nodded. The Cardiff scurried by them, smoking furiously from her stack. "Running from the storm," Timothy observed. Her captain didn't want to be caught in port and wrecked on shore. Maybe he'd received a radio warning. "Isn't it a lovely sunset?" said Jennifer, who'd come aft to stand beside Timothy. Turning to look at her, he replied slowly, "I best have it clear." "You've been going to sea a long time?" she asked. "Most my life. More than 40 years. I think I'd like to become a sailor and sail all the seas. Such adventure. But girls aren't allowed to be sailors, I say. Why not, Captain Timothy?" He examined her. Her skin was like those jars they call porcelain. She was so serious. If he was a Buckra and had a daughter, he'd like her to be a Jennifer Rankin. He laughed softly. "'Tis a hard life out there. There are days when the sea is calm and pretty, then days when she go wild and the waves turn white high as the mast. Those days 'tis no place for man or woman." The horizon flamed again for a few minutes at dawn. As the bowl of the sky lightened, Timothy, who had only dozed during the hot, still night, staying by the helm, saw that the cat-tailed clouds, now stretching into bands across the sky, had begun to thicken and rise. The barometer started to fall, and a light easterly breeze rippled the long, oily swells that rolled as fast as the eye could see. He estimated that the Hetty Red had now drifted about 25 miles west and north of Antigua. If the hurricane gave him time, he'd run west and duck into the lee of St. Kitts, knowing that its mountain towered up almost 4,000 feet, providing some shelter from the wild wind. Mid-morning, when an arc of dense, dark clouds began to form at the point where the clouds converged, Oliver Rankin, worried, approached Timothy. "Are we in for a storm?" "Yes, sir. I think we are." "Can't we return to Antigua?" "I don't think we have the time. The winds be blowing us west." "You're responsible for our lives and safety, Captain," Rankin reminded him. "I'll do all I can, sir," Timothy replied. He now realized he might have made a mistake leaving Antigua. While the Hetty Red would risk being wrecked in the harbor, his passengers would have a chance at getting ashore safely. In open sea, their chances were considerably less. Shortly before 11, the barometer fell again, and light rain sprinkled the ocean. The sun vanished, and the air turned cool. At first, the rising wind was light, filling the sails, and Timothy set a course due west as bluish-black clouds swelled and spread. He ordered Alfonso and Wilmer to batten down the hatches and secure the deck. For a moment now that the Hetty Red was moving again, he considered trying to reach Antigua, but he'd have to tack back and forth to do it. There wouldn't be enough time. He was committed to running before the storm. Soon the barometer dropped as if it had no bottom, and the black clouds began to race above the schooner. The rain became torrential. Timothy shouted, "Everybody, put on the life jackets!" Alfonso had brought them up from below, and they had rigged lifelines near the helm. He ordered the passengers to hang on to the length of rope. The sails were dropped and secured. The Hetty Red would run before the winds on bare masts. It was already blowing 30 or 40 miles an hour, enough to send the hull forward without the canvas wings. Just before noon, the edge of the hurricane finally caught the Hetty Red. The wind shrieked, and mountainous waves, surging from the stern, drove the hull as if it were a tiny sliver of bark, sending it up walls of white veined water. Then it staggered down into valleys, burying the bow, the sea washing waist deep back over the deck. Timothy clung to the helm, trying to keep the schooner bow first in the waves. He glanced at the huddled, drenched passengers and crew. They were holding desperately to their lifelines. He couldn't see Dr. Bird. He shouted to Alfonso. "Overboard!" Alfonso shouted back. Rankin's face was flower white. He was gripping the lifeline with one hand, holding Jennifer with the other. For almost 2 hours the Red survived the giant gray seas that were towering over her stern, then lifting her with a mighty thrust to drop her into another huge hollow. Timothy had never seen such rage in the sea. As he watched helplessly, John Dews let go of the lifeline, and though Wilmer tried to grab him as his body hung on to the after rail for a few seconds, he tumbled into the water. Finally, the Hetty Red surrendered. A mountain wave racing down on her before she could struggle up from the last one, twisted the hull sideways, and she turned turtle, mass pointing toward the bottom, for a few seconds. Her rigging entangled. Timothy, Alfonso, Wilmer, and Oliver Rankin, Jennifer, disappeared. Timothy broke loose and fought back to the surface, seeing Jennifer floating nearby in her cork life jacket. He used all his strength to swim to her, wrap his arm around her. She was unconscious. He found the stub of a boom and hooked one arm over it, holding her with the other. They rowed the huge sea. Finally, she came to, but did not speak. She just looked at him with those green eyes. They seemed to be asking, "Why did this happen to us? To me?" Her sodden red hair framed her face. He shouted, "Hang on! Hang on!" A few seconds later, the wooden box containing Captain Josiah Red skidded down the hill of a wave near them. Timothy ducked from it, turning away. The spirits of the ocean breeze had gotten what they wanted. For the next 2 hours, Timothy and Jennifer struggled in the ocean mountains, streaking with white spindrifts, gasping into the hollows, rising to the crests where the wild wind tore off wave tops and made blinding, salty arrows out of them. Timothy knew Jennifer was swallowing water, and he could feel the strength leaving her. She'd closed her eyes, giving up. He shouted to her again and again, "We'll lib! We'll lib!" But there was no response. The roaring wind slowed, then it ceased. Quiet descended and the clouds parted. The sun shone down brightly on the still heaving, foam-licked gray seas. They were floating in the eye of the hurricane, and Timothy kept saying encouraging words to Jennifer, even though he knew she was dead from exhaustion and terror. He also knew that the full fury of the storm, coming from the opposite direction, would likely start again within an hour. But he refused to give up the slight body he was holding. A day later, Timothy, still holding Jennifer Rankin, washed ashore of the island of Nevis. He was the only survivor of the schooner, Hetty Red. Jennifer stared lifelessly at him as he dragged her up onto the beach. He knew he'd forever be haunted by that pretty face and those warm green eyes. He alone had made the decision as captain to leave the comparative safety of St. John's Harbor. There were dark times ahead, day and night, when he would wish he'd drowned with Jennifer.